On September 17, 2025, silence gave way to shock inside the United Nations General Assembly. The world's diplomats had gathered expecting routine speeches, the usual choreography of polite applause and recycled promises. But what unfolded that afternoon was unlike anything the UN had witnessed in nearly 8 decades. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood at the podium, his voice steady, his words sharp, and his demand unmistakable: $847 billion in reparations from France. It wasn't a plea, it was an indictment. Traoré spoke not only for 28 million Burkinabe, but for 1.4 billion Africans whose history of exploitation still bleeds into the present. He accused the United Nations itself of serving as cover for colonial theft, of validating interventions, and of protecting the same powers that had siphoned Africa's wealth for generations. And then came the ultimatum that sent a chill across Western delegations: if justice is denied, Africa may walk out of these institutions altogether. The reaction was thunderous. 32 African delegations rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted 12 minutes. Applause spread across the hall as China, Russia, India, and Brazil joined in. Meanwhile, the seats of France, the United States, and their allies remained frozen, their silence louder than any speech. This was more than diplomatic theater. It was a moment of confrontation when a small, landlocked nation forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about power, wealth, and justice. For older generations in America who lived through civil rights marches and watched leaders defy impossible odds, this moment at the UN may feel hauntingly familiar. But here is the question we must all wrestle with. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's demand for $847 billion is realistic, or is it the first step toward rewriting the rules of global governance? If you think these turning points matter, don't just watch, be part of the conversation. Please share this video if you believe history is unfolding before our eyes, and subscribe, because the truth behind Africa's rise is far more important than the headlines. At exactly 2:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on September 17, 2025, the tension inside the United Nations General Assembly Hall reached a peak. Delegates adjusted their earpieces, translators leaned closer to their microphones, and journalists prepared their cameras. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso took the podium, few could have predicted the force of what was about to unfold. He began not with flattery, nor with calls for partnership, but with a direct confrontation. Distinguished delegates, he declared, I stand before you not as a supplicant seeking Western approval, but as the voice of 28 million Burkinabe and 1.4 billion Africans. In those opening lines, Traoré set the stage for a speech that would tear through decades of diplomatic protocol. His accusation was blunt. For 78 years, the United Nations had legitimized the exploitation of the Global South. He listed the betrayals, resource extraction, military interventions, cloaked in humanitarian rhetoric, financial domination through international institutions, and the steady enrichment of the same 5 permanent Security Council members who won a war in 1945. The implication was clear: this system was never designed to serve Africa. Then came the figure that shook the chamber: $847 billion. With carefully prepared documents in hand, Traoré presented a forensic accounting of France's exploitation of Burkina Faso since independence in 1960. He spoke of the CFA franc system, a monetary arrangement that required African nations to deposit half their reserves in the French treasury. By Traoré's count, this alone had drained $312 billion. He detailed how Burkina Faso's gold, worth nearly $285 billion, had been taken with only a fraction retained locally. Uranium mining had yielded $89 billion, yet less than 5% reached the Burkinabe state. Cotton exports processed in French factories and resold at inflated prices added another $74 billion to the tally, and manganese, along with other minerals, contributed tens of billions more. Together, he argued, these mechanisms of exploitation formed not just an economic imbalance, but a crime: systematic theft legitimized by international law. He reminded the Assembly of UN Resolution 1514 on decolonization, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and international legal precedents that established the right to reparations. This was not just a political statement, he insisted it was a legal demand. France. Traoré announced owes Burkina Faso and its people $847 billion in reparations for 6 decades of systematic exploitation. His words echoed through the chamber, and the silence that followed was deafening. But the speech did not stop at numbers. Traoré placed the legitimacy of the United Nations itself on trial. He condemned the structure of the Security Council where 5 nations held veto power over the fates of billions. Africa has 54 countries and 1.4 billion people. He said yet France, with just 68 million citizens, can veto any resolution affecting African security. This is not governance. This is institutionalized imperialism. He broadened the attack to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, calling them instruments of economic colonialism. He recounted how structural adjustment programs had deindustrialized Africa, privatized resources, and shackled governments with debt. Whenever Burkina Faso attempted to nationalize its gold mines or build industries for its people, Western institutions threatened sanctions. Whenever the country sought partnerships with Russia or China, it was accused of undermining the rules-based international order. Whose rules, he asked, his voice rising? Whose order? The colonial powers. The chamber grew restless. Some Western delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but many from Africa, Asia, and Latin America leaned forward nodding. This was not the careful language of compromise. They were hearing a leader dismantle piece by piece the foundations of the post-war international system. And then came the ultimatum. If the United Nations refused to establish a tribunal with binding authority to oversee reparations, Traoré warned African nations would have no choice but to withdraw from institutions that legitimize our continued exploitation. For the first time, the possibility of an African walkout from the UN was spoken aloud. The moment was electric. For observers in the gallery, it was clear this was no ordinary address. It was a declaration of independence not for one nation, but for an entire continent. The ultimatum hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, the hall was silent. Then it began, the sound of hands striking together slowly at first, then building into a roar. 32 African delegations rose to their feet, breaking the silence with a standing ovation that thundered across the General Assembly chamber. Delegates clapped, shouted, and cheered as if history itself had finally been spoken aloud. The ovation lasted 12 uninterrupted minutes, an eternity in diplomatic protocol, long enough for cameras to capture every tear, every clenched fist, every nod of solidarity. What stunned the world was not only Africa's unity, but the response from the global south. China's delegation joined in immediately. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stood and applauded. India's representatives nodded firmly, while Brazil's delegation rose with Latin American pride. Soon, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea followed. The chamber split in two, the South on its feet, the West glued to their seats. The contrast was striking. On one side, joy, anger, and unity burst forth from nations long silenced in global politics. On the other, stony faces, crossed arms, and awkward glances among Western diplomats who suddenly looked like guests at their own ceremony. The cameras caught it all. American officials whispering nervously, French delegates visibly flustered, Britain's representatives frozen in disbelief. Even UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, seated on the podium, could not mask his discomfort, shifting in his chair as the ovation refused to end. For the first time in decades, the General Assembly felt like a battlefield of legitimacy. Who truly represented the world, the handful of Western powers that held vetoes, or the billions of people represented by the nations standing and applauding inside the chamber? The emotions spilled over. Delegates from Ghana embraced their Nigerian counterparts. South Africa's representatives raised their fists. Kenya's ambassador called Traoré's words the first true demand for justice in this hall since decolonization. Even diplomats from outside Africa, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bolivia were seen clapping enthusiastically, sensing the winds of history shifting. Meanwhile, Western media correspondents rushed to file urgent reports. Headlines would soon scream, "Explosive UN speech, threatens walkout, Traoré demands $847 billion, and General Assembly in uproar." For mainstream networks in Europe and America, the shock was palpable. This was not a polite request for reform. It was a rebellion on the world stage. In Washington, the initial reaction was one of alarm. The U.S. Secretary of State quickly dismissed Traoré's words as divisive rhetoric that threatens international cooperation. But the very need to respond showed how rattled the West had become. In Paris, the French foreign minister tried to brand the accusations as baseless, while insisting France was a development partner to Africa. In London and Berlin, officials repeated a line about reparations being historically inaccurate and economically impossible. Yet none of these responses could hide the fact that the world had just witnessed something unprecedented. This was the climax, when applause for Africa became an indictment of the West. The symbolism of the ovation went beyond Burkina Faso. It was a moment when Africa, Asia, and Latin America openly confronted the post-World War II order. And unlike previous speeches that faded after a day's headlines, this one had a concrete threat attached: an African withdrawal from the UN and the creation of a Global South Assembly to replace it. The drama did not end when the clapping stopped. In the hallways of the UN, journalists swarmed African delegates asking whether Traoré's threat was real. Many confirmed it was. Nigerian officials said plainly, if the UN refuses justice, Africa must walk out together. South Africa's ambassador added, this is not a performance, it is a promise. Western diplomats, in contrast, moved quickly to private side meetings, strategizing how to contain the damage. Some reportedly pressured smaller nations with threats of aid cuts. Others hinted at sanctions if the reparations demand gained traction. But the images of the ovation had already circled the globe. For millions watching online, especially across Africa, this was a defining picture: their leaders standing tall while the old powers sat in silence. In living rooms across Ouagadougou, Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, people replayed the moment with tears and pride. For older Americans, watching echoes of the civil rights era seemed to reverberate: a leader daring to speak truth to power, backed not by armies, but by moral conviction and unity. The reactions of September 17th were not just diplomatic protocol, they were proof that the balance of legitimacy in global governance had shifted, and the West knew it. The echoes of Traoré's words did not remain confined to the marble halls of New York. Within hours, their impact rippled across continents, igniting both pride and panic. In Burkina Faso, the reaction was immediate and deeply emotional. Crowds poured into Ouagadougou's Independence Square, waving flags, chanting songs of Thomas Sankara, and holding banners that read, 847 billion, justice now, and Africa will not kneel. For many ordinary Burkinabé, this was not abstract diplomacy, it was about dignity. Gold miners in the north spoke of generations who had labored only to see wealth vanish abroad. Farmers recalled cotton sold cheaply, while finished fabrics returned at 10 times the price. Now they felt their leader had finally named the theft aloud on the world's largest stage. In the Sahel region, where decades of poverty and insecurity have tested people's faith in politics, Traoré's demand felt like vindication. Radio stations replayed clips of the 12-minute ovation. Village elders told younger generations, this is our Sankara reborn. The symbolism was clear: one man had spoken for millions who felt invisible. Across Africa, governments scrambled to position themselves. Nigeria declared that the era of silent suffering is over. Western extraction must be compensated. Ghana's president urged the continent to speak with one voice in international forums. Kenya went further, suggesting that if the UN failed to act, the Global South Assembly proposed by Traoré could become a reality. Even in South Africa, where leaders often balance ties with the West, the foreign ministry acknowledged Africa must unite behind historical justice. But with solidarity came pushback and fear. Western institutions moved swiftly. At the IMF and World Bank, officials hinted that loans could be delayed or suspended for countries supporting reparations. Western banks began quietly tightening credit lines for African governments. Rumors spread of multinational corporations considering withdrawal of investments. For leaders across the continent, the question loomed: would standing with Burkina Faso come at the cost of economic strangulation? Inside Burkina Faso, however, the risks were reframed as opportunities. Economists close to the government argued that even if reparations never arrived, the act of demanding them had shifted global debate. By exposing the numbers, $847 billion drained from a single small nation, Traoré had created a rallying point for reform. Opposition parties, though critical of his boldness, admitted privately that the speech had captured the public's imagination in ways no domestic policy ever could. The political landscape inside the country hardened around sovereignty. Burkinabe youth movements organized rallies not just in support of reparations, but also demanding accelerated nationalization of resources and stronger ties with other Global South partners. The December 15th conference in Ouagadougou, announced during the UN speech, suddenly became more than a diplomatic summit. It was seen as a chance to make the capital of a landlocked African nation the birthplace of a new global order. For ordinary citizens, the consequences were immediate. In another way, a newfound sense of empowerment. Teachers in rural schools began lessons with discussions of Traoré's speech. Musicians released songs praising his defiance. In marketplaces, mothers told their children, "Remember this day when our president stood tall and demanded what was stolen." Still, the risks were real. Western media painted Traoré as a dangerous populist warning of isolation and economic collapse. Analysts in Washington and Paris suggested covert strategies to contain his influence. African activists feared increased political pressure sanctions or even destabilization attempts reminiscent of Libya's collapse after Gaddafi challenged Western dominance. Yet the momentum seemed unstoppable. Just as the Bandung Conference of 1955 had once birthed the non-aligned movement, the Ouagadougou Conference of 2025 promised to push the Global South into a new phase, one of open defiance, institutional alternatives, and collective bargaining power. The civil and political consequences were clear in demanding reparations. Traoré had not only put France on trial, he had reshaped the imagination of an entire continent. Whether it ended in confrontation or transformation, Africa would never look at the United Nations the same way again. While Africa celebrated the ripples of September 17th, reached the power centers of the world with very different tones. In Washington, senior officials gathered for emergency briefings. The U.S. Secretary of State dismissed Traoré's words as divisive rhetoric, but beneath the surface the concern was serious. If African nations truly coordinated a walkout or pursued reparations through international law, the credibility of institutions built after World War II, institutions America helped design, could crumble. Analysts warned that Washington faced not just a diplomatic challenge, but a structural one, the possibility that the majority of the world would create its own system beyond U.S. influence. In Paris, the reaction was one of anger mixed with fear. France had the most to lose. For decades, the CFA franc system and resource contracts had tethered African economies to Paris. The figure of $847 billion, calculated and announced so publicly, was more than a demand. It was a number that could inspire similar claims from 14 other CFA franc countries. French officials scrambled to portray Traoré's accusations as baseless, but domestic newspapers admitted privately that if the precedent spread, France's entire African policy could unravel. Britain and Germany took a softer line, calling reparations historically inaccurate and economically impossible. Yet their real fear lay in precedent. If Burkina Faso succeeded, India could revisit claims against Britain, Latin America could reopen debates with Spain and Portugal, and indigenous groups could demand restitution in North America. In other words, one successful reparations tribunal could open the floodgates to trillions in global claims. Meanwhile, in Moscow and Beijing, the tone was entirely different. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov declared that the UN reflected the power balance of 1945, not 2025, and that Traoré's challenge deserved attention. China's ambassador spoke plainly. Captain Traoré speaks truth about a system that serves the few at the expense of the many. For both Russia and China, the speech was a gift, a chance to accelerate the multipolar order they had long advocated. They quickly signaled support for the December 15th Ouagadougou Conference, positioning themselves as patrons of a global South-led transformation. India and Brazil, while more cautious, also expressed solidarity. India reiterated its decades-long call for UN Security Council reform, noting that Traoré's proposal aligned with its vision of a more democratic global system. Brazil, representing Latin America, underscored that Africa's frustration mirrored its own struggles with Western-dominated institutions. Even outside the expected alliances, smaller nations voiced enthusiasm. Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran welcomed the proposal as a step toward independence from Western sanctions. Pakistan and Bangladesh signaled interest in attending the Ouagadougou Conference. Within weeks, over 60 countries were reported to be considering participation enough to represent 6.5 billion people, a majority of humanity. Western media launched its counter-offensive. Headlines framed the speech as populist grandstanding or warned of new authoritarian blocs. Yet the images told another story, a hall divided, one side standing and cheering, the other sitting in silence. For ordinary citizens across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, those images carried more weight than op-eds in the New York Times or Le Monde. For Americans watching at home, especially older generations who remembered civil rights struggles, Traoré's words stirred uncomfortable parallels. Was this not the same language of justice and reparations once heard on U.S. soil? Could America, with its own history of slavery and racial injustice, credibly oppose Africa's call for accountability? The global picture was unmistakable. September 17th was no longer just Burkina Faso's fight. It was the moment the Global South openly challenged Western monopoly over international institutions. Whether through reparations or the creation of the Global South Assembly, the balance of power in world governance had begun to tilt. September the 17th, 2025 will not fade easily from memory. For 47 minutes, Captain Ibrahim Traoré turned the United Nations into a courtroom, the West into the accused, and Africa into the plaintiff demanding justice. His call for $847 billion in reparations was more than a number, it was a line in the sand. And his threat of an African walkout from the UN was not just rhetoric, it was a declaration that a new chapter in global governance has begun. But with such boldness comes danger. History tells us that leaders who challenge entrenched powers often face sabotage, sanctions, or worse. Libya's collapse after Gaddafi, the coups and assassinations of Pan-Africanists in the past, all are reminders of what the West may do when its dominance is threatened. As the December 15th conference in Ouagadougou approaches, the world must ask, will the Global South Assembly truly take shape, or will it be strangled before birth? The implications stretch far beyond Africa. If reparations claims spread, if alternative institutions emerge, then the very foundations of the post-war order, the IMF, the World Bank, the Security Council could crumble. That means the balance of power Americans have taken for granted for generations may shift in ways few imagined possible. So I leave you with these questions. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's demand is the spark of a global transformation? Or will the West succeed in silencing this challenge as it has so many times before? Can we continue to trust institutions built on exploitation, or is it time to build something entirely new? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines, because the battle over justice, sovereignty, and the future of our world has only just begun.